Hello everyone and welcome back to my online lecture series. I welcome my podcast listeners worldwide, Different Colors of Life with Kiran on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify and different platforms. I welcome all of you on my YouTube channel Kiran W. Gutte. On this YouTube channel, you can watch my educational videos and other videos. To watch these videos, you can subscribe my channel. You can press the bell icon to get the updates of my channel. Today, we are going to discuss Sir Philip Sidney, his apology for poetry. Sir Philip Sidney was an English poet, courtier, scholar, and soldier who is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of Elizabethan age. His works include Astrophel and Stella, the Defence of Poesy, which is also known as the Defence of Poetry or an Apology for Poetry, and Arcadia. Sir Philip Sidney was mortally wounded at Battle of Zutphen, thirsty and with excess of bleeding, he passed on the bottle of water brought to him to a poor soldier in the same agony of thirst and death, saying, "Thy need is greater than mine." Stephen Gosson, a former playwright, dedicated his Schoole of Abuse to Sir Philip Sidney. It was believed that Sidney was motivated by Gosson, a former playwright who has dedicated his attack on English stage. Sidney's line of defense follows line of attack. Gosson had indicated poetry on 4 counts. A man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. Poetry is waste of time according to Stephen Gosson, and poetry is mother of lies. Poetry is nurse of abuse, and Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Sidney replies to each one of these charges through his An Apology for Poetry. It was written in 1585 and was published posthumously in 1595 in 2 editions under 2 different titles by 2 different persons. First was Henry Ponsonby, called his edition The Defence of Poesy, and second was Henry Olney, called his edition as An Apology for Poetry. The work belongs to the genre of oratory. It is said to be the first important critical text in English literary criticism. Sidney was known as honest statesman, a fearless courtier, and true poet. What is the occasion for an apology of poetry? As we have discussed, Stephen Gosson, a dramatist and a man of theatre, published a book, Schoole of Abuse, in 1579. The book was dedicated to Sidney without his permission and knowledge. It appealed as intended mischief to dedicate an invective to a gentlemanly writer. Sidney's essay is more than reply to Gosson. It glorifies poetry as social significance. This essay is having 91 paragraphs. In it, he talks about occasion of writing the essay, nature and function of poetry, types of poetry and their excellence and demerits. He even discusses objections or charges against poetry and refutation of charges and state of poetry in contemporary times. Nature of poetry. In this section, Sidney traces the origin of poetry to say that It was a matrix from which knowledge sprang. It was the mother of all knowledge. In ancient world and new world, poetry enjoyed an honorable position. The Romans called the poet a seer, possessing divine gift of seeing into life and things. The poet used to charm listeners. The Greek called poet a maker. Poetry inspires every listener and it dispels the darkness of ignorance in the world. According to Sidney, poetry is first light giver to ignorance and the first nurse. Greek philosophers Plato, Pythagoras wrote in verse to spread their moral counsels. Historians like Herodotus used verse to impress upon people's mind the glorious history of their nations. Even Turkey, there existed two categories of civilized men. First, lawgivers and second, poets. The Irish and early Britons were inspired by poetry to be civilized. The oracles at Delphi delivered their prophecies in verse. The astronomers and lawmakers also used verse to communicate their ideas. For Sidney, art is the imitation of nature, but it is not slavish imitation as Plato views. Rather, it is creative imitation. Nature is dull, incomplete and ugly. It is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. He employs his creative faculty, imagination and style of presentation to decorate the raw materials of nature. For Sidney, art is a speaking picture having spatio-temporal dimension. For Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is important. Artists are to create arts, considering the level of readers. The only purpose of art is to teach and to delight, like the whole tendency of Renaissance. Sidney favors poetic justice that is possible in poets' world where good are rewarded and wicked people are punished. Poet, through his power of inventive genius, brings into existence another more beautiful world. The poet transcends nature by idealizing her and humanity. Definition of poetry and its function. Sidney defines poetry as an art of imitation, representing, counterfeiting or figuring forth a speaking picture with the end to teach and delight. According to Sidney, poetry emphasizes imitation as being basis of art. Plato, Aristotle, Horace, all of whom called poetry a speaking picture. Ben Jonson regarded poetry and painting to be alike nature and praises Plutarch for saying that poetry is a speaking picture and painting as a mute poetry. Sidney follows Horace in calling poetry as a delightful instruction. Sidney considered three kinds of poetry which fulfilled the end of poetry or the aim of poetry, namely to teach and to delight. They are the sacred poetry, philosophical or didactic poetry, and the right poetry. The first group of poetry restricted by theology, which predominates. The poets of second group are also circumscribed because of their dependence on external sources for material such as the sciences or other disciplines. The third group of poets are the real poets since they transcend all the limitations and give a free rein to their creative imagination. Sidney answers the Puritans of his time to affirm that the poet's worship of beauty and nature is not meant to ponder or cater to senses and surrender to the world, but uplifts readers above the level of earthly beauty to that of contemplation of imperishable beauty. The poet inspires readers to virtuous actions through knowledge of all kinds of virtues. There is a timeless quality of poetry that makes us know why the poets are universal genius. Superiority of poetry. Distinction between poetry, philosophy and history. Even a cursory view at Sidney's apology may prove that Sidney has an exalted conception of nature and function of poetry. Following Minturno, he says that poetry is the first light giver to ignorance. It nourished before any other art or science. The first philosophers and historians were poets, and such supreme works as Psalms of David and Dialogues of Plato are in really poetical. Among the Greeks and Romans, the poet was regarded as a sage or prophet, and no nation, however primitive or barbarous, has been without poets, or has failed to receive delight and instruction from poetry. Poetry, according to Sidney, is an art of imitation, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end, to teach and to delight. The object of all arts and sciences is to lift human life to the highest altitudes of perfection. And in this respect, they are all servants of sovereign or poetry, whose end is well-doing and not well-knowing only. Virtuous action is therefore the end of learning, and Sidney sets out to prove that the poet, more than anyone else, fulfills this end. Showing the superiority of poetry to history and philosophy, Sidney says that while the philosopher teaches by percept alone and the historians by example alone, the poet conduces most to virtue because he employs both percept and example. The philosopher teaches virtue by showing what virtue is and what vice is, by setting down in abstract argument and without clarity or beauty of style the bare principles of morality. The historian teaches virtue by showing the experience of past age but being tied down to what actually happened, that is, to the particular truth of things and not to general possibilities. The example he depicts draws no necessary consequence. The poet alone accomplishes his dual task. What the philosopher says should be done is by the poet pictured most perfectly in someone by whom it has been done, thus coupling the general notion with the particular instance. The philosopher, moreover, teaches the learned only, but poet teaches all, and so is, in Plutarch's phrase, poet as the right popular philosopher. He seems only to promise delight and moves men to virtues unaware. But even if philosopher excels the poet in teaching, he cannot move his readers to virtuous action as the poet can. And this is of higher importance than teaching. For what is the use of teaching virtue if the pupil is not moved to act and accomplish what is taught? On the other hand, the historian deals with particular instance, with vices and virtues so mingled together in the same personage that the reader can find no pattern to imitate. Poet improves upon history. He gives examples of vice and virtues for human imitation. He makes virtues succeed and vice fail, and this history can but seldom do. Poetry does not imitate nature. It is the reader who imitates the example of perfection presented to him by the poet. So a reader is thus made virtuous. Poetry therefore conduces to virtue, the end of all learning, better than any other art or science. The basis of Sidney's distinction between the poet and the historian is the famous passage in which Aristotle explains why poetry is more philosophic and more valued than history. The poet deals not with particular, but poet deals with the universal, with what might or what should be, not with what is or what has been. But Sidney, in the assertion of his principle, follows Minturno and Scaliger and goes further than Aristotle would probably have gone. All arts have the works of nature as their principal objects of imitation and follows nature as actors follow the lines of their play. Only the poet is not tied to such subjects but creates another nature better than the nature herself, for going hand in hand with nature and being enclosed not within her limits, but only by zodiac of his own imagination he creates a golden world in place of nature's brazen, and in the sense he may be compared as a creator with God. Where shall you find in life, asked Sidney, such a friend as Pylades, such a hero as Orlando, such an excellent man as Aeneas? Furthermore, he defends poetry vigorously against Puritan's charges and says that it is not the mother of lies. Poetry is not mother of lies, but poetry is the oldest of all branches of learning and removes ignorance. Poetry delights as teaches. Poetry does not misuse and debase the mind of man by turning it to wantonness and by making it unmartial and effeminate. It is man's wit that abuses poetry and poetry that abuses man's wit. And as to making men effeminate, this charge applies to all other sciences more than to poetry, which in its description of battles and praises of valiant men stir courage and enthusiasm. Lastly, it is pointed out by the enemies of poetry that Plato, one of the greatest philosophers, banished poets from his ideal commonwealth, but Plato's dialogue is itself in the form of poetry. Kinds of poetry. Sidney defends mingling of tragic and comic forms to give rise to tragic comedy and the pastoral and the heroic as pastoral heroic or heroic pastoral. About pastoral poetry, he says that it takes readers into regions of nature, the woods, the lakes, the birds, and all where innocence mingled with truth and love prevails, where evil is seduced by virtue and goodness into the dropping its original contumely. Pastoral refines, purifies the heart, teaches patience, universal love of all being. Elegy, which teaches how intensely can the hurt lament another's death. There can be nothing faulty. It can taps the spring of genuine pity and sympathy for fellow being. Satirical poems which are harsh because it laughs at human follies. It has purpose of making us laugh at human follies, and it is the noble purpose of making us laugh at our follies and to be ashamed and reform ourselves. Comedies. Comedies are imitations of common errors of our life which the writer represents with a touch of ridicule. The purpose of writer is noble, that is to reform society by ridding it of its monstrosities and to make men better and virtuous. Tragedy. Tragedy is the highest form of literature as Greek think it makes to be heroic in the battling life. There are all kinds of passions and emotions. Poetic justice is the end of it. The soul of man is cleansed and afflicted by tragedy. It gives transcending truths from life for us to imitate. Next is lyric. The lyric has been perfected and projected as the vehicle of noble sentiments by Watt, Surrey and Shakespeare. It contains moral precepts, presents human problems and also praises God. The lyrics like ballads, sonnets, odes have all been popular with every age for their inherent goodness and values. Next, the heroic epic. The heroic epic cannot be condemned. It is the best and the most accomplished kind of poetry. He refers to the stories of Dido who accomplished a kind of poetry. He says that the epics have only elevated man, exhorting him to strive, exposing his insecure place in the vast order of universe. As Sidney considers the moral aspect of poetry and its various forms, his scope is limited. Sidney emphasizes that the aim of poetry is to lead and draw us as high and a perfection as we are able of. Charges against poetry and Sidney's refutation. It is seen that Sidney, instead of straightway beginning his essay with refuting the charges elevated against poetry with evidences, the excellence of poetry to invoke the spirit of persuasion. What are the charges against the poetry? A man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. Poetry is a waste of time. Poetry is mother of lies. Poetry is nurse of abuse, that is immoral, and Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Sidney defends poetry against the first charge by saying that no other discipline or source of knowledge is greater than poetry, because it teaches every kind of virtue to man in social, ethical, and moral context. It also moves man to virtuous thoughts and virtuous actions. The second charge against the poetry that poets are liars. Sidney says that it is fiction. Sidney employs the logical method that poetry cannot tell or affirm as astronomers do. So question of telling lies does not arise at all. Writers of literature give fictitious names to characters and presents life ideally and draws a universal truth or poetic truth. So universal truth cannot prove wrong, so poetry cannot lie. Characters represent a class of men who are good for all time. The third charge against the poetry is that poetry corrupts men by making heroic men lament and weep. Sidney answers by saying that poetry itself is not corrupt or does not intend to abuse. It is the use to which bad or mean poets put it. Love is a theme of poetry, and the emotion aroused by it is noble emotion. If a bad poet represents lust as love, it is bad poet who abuses poetry. The right use of poetry always does well. The wrong use of anything leads to abuse. Poetry has the power to move men, and that makes poetry excellent teacher. The last charge that Plato banished poets from his commonwealth is refuted by saying that Plato himself wrote in verse to make his philosophy easily understood. Plato, on the other hand, was patron, not the adversary of poetry. Plato condemned bad poets who in their ignorance abuses God and represented God and religion irrelevantly. Plato banished these bad poets, not all poets. Plato has always admired Homer. The state of English poetry. In fourth section of his essay, Sidney examines the state of poetry, drama and other forms of poetry to show how the inept manner of writing poetry caused defamation of poetry. Sidney finds a few causes of poetry falling into disrepute in England. The first reason was that there was a lack of spirit in age. The majority of poets who wrote lacked inspiration, and this age was congenial for great and noble poetry. The country was engaged in the war. The second reason was that the inferior men equipped with poor learning or scholarship and art. The third reason was that poets who were not to be born poets but only by chance become poets. The fourth reason was that those who wrote poetry lacked training, practice and application. Their poetry was artificial and flouted all rules of poetry in order to gain immediate popularity and wealth. Sidney regrets that up to his own time, England had produced only few poets like Chaucer, Spenser and Surrey. English tragedies and comedies were in degraded state. The comedy writers did not understand the true spirit of comic and confused laughter with pleasure. Sidney says, true comedy should teach through delighting, not provide vulgar amusement. The lyric was much abused. It was tame and artificial. Metaphors were used without thought and they were most far-fetched. A proper combination of art and nature, which is real art, was flagrantly abused. Sidney submits that English language was most suited to verse and rhyme because of its flexibility, adaptability and simplified grammar. Poetry, well written in full consciousness of rules, aim and purpose shall always be venerated, he concludes. So thank you for being with me. You can subscribe this channel to get more videos. You can like, you can share this video with the students and academicians. Thank you for listening my podcast on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast and Spotify and other different platforms. So thank you everyone and goodbye.